Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Linda Jalbert, and I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the RMS board and staff. Thanks for taking the time to be with us today to share and listen about one of the many challenges that you're facing these days, that of navigating river management. I want to also thank our facilitators and our organizers, Bo and Dan, Doug, and Risa, who's behind the scenes right now, for making this webinar happen. I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks again. Turn it over to you guys.
Okay, thanks, Linda. Hi, everybody. Well, this is a little bit of new territory. It's kind of like running a river for the first time, right? There will be a few surprises here, but it's going to be okay. We'll all start at the top and wind up at the bottom, maybe in the boat, maybe out of the boat. It's all good. Thanks again to Linda and Risa and RMS, my favorite professional organization all these years that I've been in my career, for making this happen. Thanks to all of you for participating. We had no idea how this might work out, and that there are 100 people out there is kind of a surprise to all of us. So anyway, thanks for being here. An unfortunate occasion, but it's great to get together, so thanks. We've got about 60 minutes. We'll stick to that. We'll make sure that we end on time. Just kind of to start on a little bit of a personal note, the way this thing got started, which was literally less than a week ago, was a combination of a little bit of a personal thing and a little bit of a professional thing. The personal thing was that Kathy and I had a Grand Canyon trip we were supposed to be putting in for about a week from now. And we'd been working on gear, and when the trip got canceled, the gear, of course, was still there, and so we've been working on gear. And she came out the other day with a little bit of a quivering chin and said, geez, this is the first time in 25 years we're not going to have a river trip. So that's the first part of the title. The second part of the title was professional. Last week, the RMS board was meeting, and about a dozen participants, and we spent a little bit of time in a way that we wouldn't have in a usual meeting, just going around the room and sharing who was where and what you were doing, and that seemed really useful. So anyway, that's how this all evolved. We've got 60 minutes. We're going to share information. Hopefully, it'll be a little bit of a conversation and not just a bunch of speech making. We sent you out the agenda initially when you signed up, so that's roughly what we're going to be doing, although it's rearranged a little bit. In terms of how to participate, like I said, there's 100 people out there, and that's a little unwieldy for this format. We've basically got 3 presenters, that's Dan and Doug and me. We've got 24 panelists, and those are people that we kind of chose, you know, it was just a quick hand-waving selection to try and get some geographic diversity in different agencies and types of rivers. So those are the people that will have easier access to microphones. The remaining 65 or so people, it would be great to have you participate as well, but the way that you do that is that you type something into a chat box, and Dan will try and turn that into a question or a comment or a paraphrase, or if it turns out somebody's burning with something that needs to get said, we'll figure out how to turn on a mic. But at any rate, that's the basic format. Okay, that okay with everybody? Dan, Doug,
Good.
seem okay?
Yep.
All right, thank you. All right, well, we should probably go ahead and get started, right? We don't want to wait for all those camera problems to get solved. Okay, so first slide, you know, you've got the title here. The basic idea is sharing, like we've talked about. Let's go to slide number 2, Dan, or whoever's clicking the slides.
Oops. There we go.
All right, so, and again, ideas sharing, a couple of different ways to do that. Dan, any other hints for people about how to get information in?
Just, yeah, for attendees, the chat window, I'm watching the chat window, and for panelists, if you give me a little wave, that can help let me know, or you guys can also get in touch with me through the chat window.
All right, this is not an elaborate slideshow. Again, this whole thing came together pretty quickly. We didn't have any idea quite how that was going to work out, but we need to spend about 5 minutes per topic. So we'll just try and organize our time or budget our time so that we get to talk about all the different topics. So let's go to the next slide, Dan. When we sent the invitation out, we asked you guys to give us just a little bit of information about your river. Was it open or closed? And then some comments. And so Doug, you want to summarize what we learned there?
Sure, and I'll start also just by summarizing who we think is on board. So when we had 90 people as of yesterday afternoon, we had about 25% from the Forest Service, the Park Service, and the BLM. And then we had the rest of the 25% were sort of split up between people from consulting firms, NGOs, a few folks from states, a few outfitters
Muted.
that work with outfitters, and then a few county and local people too. And we have one Fish and Wildlife Service person. So anyway, that tells you a little bit about who's out there or who may be on the call. And then with regard to that question, we have about 7% that are closed to all public use. We've got about 24% that are open just as normal, and 70%, which is in between that, which is some sort of limited closures that are going on. And among those limited closures, the most frequently mentioned were things like restrooms and campgrounds were closed. A few places have closed parking lots as well. In a few cases, the entire access road system into a forest or whatnot is closed. And several talked about having just applying social distancing advisories to their places. A very few number of rivers have talked about how they're not letting outfitters operate, or that outfitters are not operating at this time. And a couple talked about reducing group size limits, with a couple of numbers out there being 5 and 10 that fits with some of the state's kind of guidelines and whatnot. And then finally, a couple other interesting ones that people mentioned. One place has got their bathrooms closed by signs, but they've left them unlocked and usable. So that's sort of an interesting in-between option. And then one place mentioned that they're letting only local people use it, so you have to be from the county that the place is in to use the place. So that's another sort of interesting thing about trying to prevent travel, basically. That work?
Yeah, that's great. All right, so as you know, that's the information that we got from your actual signups. So from here on in, if you have things you want to contribute, you're going to have to do it via the chat box, or the people that are listed as panelists, you can get your mic turned on. We'll see how this goes. Otherwise, you're going to have to, we can exchange kind of the stories that we have. We'll just see how this goes, you guys. All right, so next slide, Dan. All right, so the question here is, what are you seeing if your river is currently in an open condition, or there are some others like the Alaska rivers are still frozen or got snow on them. There are some other folks in the lower 48 that indicated that their conditions are still making it so that you wouldn't expect to see people out there. But either what are you seeing out there right now, or what do you expect to see when those weather or other conditions make it so that your place is usable? Looks like Joby's got some.
Your mic's off.
Support staffing. So visitation is, even though the parks are open, there's hardly any visitation. Only locals with day use intentions, like just boating or fishing, are out there. We have no visitors.
Okay. When people are using, here's a question for you. When people are using places, are they flummoxed by for example, having the restrooms be closed? We've got 2 different places right near our house that I've been going to either for hiking or biking, and one of them is completely closed, and the other one is open, but they've got their facilities closed. And so they've got a sign that tells you, for example, be prepared for closed restrooms, which is kind of like, I think of that as starting your river trip before you get to the put-in, where you're supposed to be ready for all that stuff, as opposed to starting it after you leave the put-in where the bathrooms are.
Right. That's a good question. The South Florida parks have restrooms outside of the visitor facilities, so those are open, but there is no staff to support anybody.
Okay.
There's hardly anybody out there.
Okay. Anybody else with a report that's kind of different from that, seeing a different situation? But by the way, those two different places that I was describing, the one that's open at all is really busy because the other one is closed, and you know, you kind of squeezed one part of it and part of the system and sent people over to the other one. All right, maybe we should just go ahead and move on to the next item. So let's take a look at the next slide. All right, well, the reason for our mentioning this item is that, just like the photos suggest here, different activities can be pretty different in terms of what we're now considering the new normal for how close you get to other people. If it's like this big photo where people go on individual boats on a relatively low use river, staying apart, at least from the other canoe, is pretty easy. You don't get quite far enough apart from the people in your own boat, unless it's a long boat like this one. So anyway, there's that kind of consideration. And then there's the different activity, like that inset for tubing. That one's probably from the Niobrara, although it could be other tubing rivers, where part of what people do is they pack into their boats and then they kind of raft the boats together, and it's just the opposite of what we think of as the new distancing standards, the safety distance standards that we're now using. So anyway, any insights about those two kinds of things, or anything in between? Sherry, I see Sherry's hand up, Dan.
Hey, I just wanted to mention some things that I've been hearing that people are trying to put into practice. One is, of course, moving to more places that have traditionally issued their permits in person. They're looking at ways to issue them online so that they don't have to have that interface. The other thing that a lot of places are looking at is something that we hear every once in a while, which is timed launches, so that we don't, that crowding that occurs on a lot of the rivers is that put-in scene, right? So a lot of rivers are actually looking at ways to actually send each separate group a specific launch time. So then they are not interfacing with 4 outfitters and 5 other privates, and hopefully trying to minimize that contact from all over the universe. And then finally, a lot of places are encouraging people to take trips with their family unit or people that they have been in quarantine with, this entire time. So those are just a few of the things I've been hearing.
That's great stuff. Thanks, Sherry. Go ahead, Doug.
So one other thing that's worth talking about, so Sherry brought up that there are some rivers that are permitted, and there's a list on the RMS webpage, I think, that lays out who's doing what right now. So which rivers are suspended, which ones are still haven't made a decision on it, that sort of thing. It's sort of scattershot, but it's another resource for you if you're looking for who's doing what. And then I just thought of it now. We have the list of people that are attending this webinar and their answers to their question in a spreadsheet, and we're going to send that to everybody, but after the webinar, so that you don't spend it looking at the data instead of listening to our pearls of wisdom. Anyway, we'll have that for you afterwards, but it'll be another resource for you to kind of figure out who's doing what, and it's got a bunch of things like what Sherry was just talking about. So,
yeah, one of the things that your comments bring up, Sherry, is again that contrast that between those two areas I was talking about near our house. The one, they just said, hey, we can't guarantee that we meet the CDC and state guidelines, so we're closing everything. And that's on one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is, hey, we think we can keep this open and maintain those things, but we're going to have to encourage people to behave a little differently, or we're going to have to manage differently, or we're going to have to do more managing. And so anyway, that's part of what prompted us to hold this webinar, was just allowing everybody to share or think about what are those two extremes, and then what are the other choices in between. All right, we good on that one? Let's move on to the next slide. Oh, sorry.
Hold on. We've got a question from Hector Santiago, who's also one of our panelists, but we don't have his video right now. And he wants to know, how are people managing their paddle share programs? And I'm assuming he's talking about gear and boat sharing programs. So if anybody has comments on that, we'd like to hear them.
Well, can anybody hear me? This is Hector.
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Hello, everybody. Glad you're healthy. Yeah, the question comes from Mississippi Recreational River. The idea is, there are a few rivers that have these paddle shares where you've got lockers and you've got equipment and people schedule, right? And they get their boat upstream somewhere, they get their equipment, and then they turn it in somewhere else. And the brainstorm right now is happening is, how do we properly disinfect and things like that? Or otherwise, has anybody thought about, how long? I think the mention earlier about the potential delay of equipment, right? And somehow, how do you space the use of equipment in order to be safe? And I didn't know if anyone was dealing with that issue. So.
Okay. Well,
and
great.
Once again, if any attendees have comments on that they'd like to share now or later, you can put that in the chat window, and I will let people know.
Okay, great. Maybe let's go to the next slide while we're waiting on that, Dan. We're learning about how to handle delays between when people start asking things and when they don't, and when we actually can handle answers. All right, so this. We've all been saying leave no trace for years, as this slide suggests. That's taken on some new dimensions that we hadn't thought of, that we weren't thinking of exactly when we started using those phrases. But it's still basically the same idea, except the traces are now including people's distance and it's not just the human waste problems that we've been trying to manage for years. Actually, we're pretty far ahead of the game on managing human waste systems on rivers. But now we're also thinking about some of those other things that have to do with coughing and sneezing and otherwise transmitting disease. So that's kind of the question here, is how do we handle that stuff? And we've talked a little bit about restroom closures. We've talked a little bit about systems that people bring with them and take away with them, which assuming that they come, we've been talking about this among ourselves, getting our work done as a pod. So if somebody that we think of as sort of a household group or a work group that are already quarantined together or in contact with each other, if they come as a pod and manage themselves as a pod and don't interact with other pods or interact at a safe distance with other pods, that's one way of dealing with things. And like I say, we've been doing that for years with packed out human waste systems on multi-day river trips. It's a tougher deal when you go to a place where there's day use and people have gotten to expect restrooms. So anyway, that's the issue, is how do people handle that kind of stuff? And if you have comments or questions about that, or Doug or Dan, you have something you want to add?
Yeah, I just add so some of the more challenging things are going to be dealing with when are the times that groups interact in the same place, or even within the same group. Like you could have one group going down the river. You could probably social distance fine at a campsite, but you might not be able to social distance fine when you're trying to shuttle vehicles. And so there's some tricks with that. And what are the sort of things we could set up? Fumigating shuttle buses and cars so that other people can, not from your group, could drive it. That's an issue. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well with outfitters, and their buses and how to put more people on a bus, and whether that's even possible, whether that makes sense. But with regard to day use, we all have our overnight multi-day trip poop systems. Maybe that's how we can go to a launch that no longer has a restroom that's open and still keep going down our rivers. Maybe, if they'll let us. But we'll see whether that's happening. It'll be interesting to see who's going to decide to let that kind of happen, and require that level of commitment from their users.
Okay, ready?
All
for
right,
the next slide?
I've got a comment from the chat window, and also I realized we kind of blew by introductions, and so just how about the next time each panelist speaks, if you could tell us your name and where you're from, that would be great. My name is Dan Shelby. I'm the one who's running this slideshow. I work for Confluence Research and Consulting, and I am in Central Oregon. And so the question is, did anyone have some practices or policies in place during norovirus situation that can be utilized now?
Okay, well, while we're thinking about getting answers to that, maybe we should go to the next slide. And thanks, Dan, for the intro prompt. I'm Bo Shelby. I'm with Confluence Research and Consulting, and I'm in Western Oregon. All right, so the next question that we thought it made sense for everybody to, for us all to get a chance to think about is, what about other impacts from closures? So, we've been talking about what do the people on trips do to kind of keep themselves safe. This one refers to what does the agency or other managing entity do to keep staff and their folks safe. And you can imagine something like a rescue or a search thing that would put a bunch of people in close proximity. Those don't happen very often, but if they happen, that's still a problem. Or more common things like the other inset box here suggests, if people get contacted because of registrations or permits or at put-ins or takeouts, or because of some kind of enforcement issue. And I guess that's another question is, are you gonna just not do any enforcement? Or if you are gonna do enforcement, how are you gonna handle that? And so the idea here is to think through those kinds of issues. Was that you waving a hand there, Doug?
Well, I was just gonna make a point that one of the ways Sherry brought up the point of doing more stuff online than in person. Of course, that's what a lot of us are doing. It's also possible to put up physical barriers, like at the grocery store, you got a bunch of plexiglass between you and checkout people now. We could certainly do that as well. It'd be a little awkward, but we're doing lots of things that are awkward these days. So,
any other things you've heard about, Sherry? You're actually in a pretty good spot to be able to hear things because of your job.
Well, of course, I mostly hear from, permitted rivers and people. I actually do get a lot of calls from folks asking what other folks are doing. So this is good timing on this webinar. Most people are really just looking at anything that they can utilize to try and keep trips together and make things continue to happen this summer. So, that's why I threw up what were people recommending when we had the norovirus scares that went through the Grand Canyon and other places a couple of years ago, because I think some of those things would still apply in this situation. Really sending out information to people on how to keep their groups, not necessarily 6 feet apart, but what are we cleaning? How are we cleaning? And what are we cleaning with? So some of those things that we can take with us on river trips that will still allow us to be as protected as possible. But like Doug mentioned, the big challenge, I think, in most of these comes with the people trying to get to the river a lot of times. They're saying in Idaho, and I'm Sherry Hughes, I work for rec.gov, and I'm sitting in central Idaho right now. But in Idaho, where I'm at, they're saying that one of the big vector points are gas stations. there's still a lot of movement with people coming, in and out of the area. And so being really, really careful when you're putting gas in your vehicle and, walking into the convenience store to pick up snacks and things like that. So, just actually giving people some tips. I will say that, everybody's doing as much as they possibly can to try and get things open back up and not have a summer without river trips.
Yeah, when we were trying to think through our Grand Canyon permit, so we started having this conversation about a month ago, I guess. In this was a private trip, and this was a trip with an emergency room doc and an emergency medical person, both on the trip. So we even felt like we were going to be pretty well taken care of. And there was a conversation initially about, well, gee, wouldn't a river trip in a nice dry climate, lots of UV sterilization, only a small number of people that, isn't that going to be a good thing? And we kind of went with that sentiment for a while. And then as things progressed, I mean, we all know lots of things have changed in the last several weeks. All of a sudden, that whole issue that you mentioned, Sherry, of, well, how are we going to get from here to there, right? We've got 2 days of driving where you've got to get through that gamut of convenience stores or overnight facilities or, getting food or whatever you do there, versus take everything with you in the car and don't stop. You can't make it on 1 tank of gas. So that didn't quite work. But there was that. And then there was, well, what are we going to do on the river? We actually bought some new dishes that we thought we could sanitize better, which is in that category of things to try and manage. And the park, we asked the park what their position was going to be, and their initial response was, hey, we think of river trips as pretty good little quarantines. So if somebody gets sick down there, that's great, you're on your own. And kind of with a smile. And then they actually at one point had a policy of, we're not going to evacuate anybody. And then it started, again, we're all kind of learning, well, what if we have a whole trip that gets, somebody gets sick and they infect everybody else on the trip? Boy, we can't just ignore that. So anyway, and then of course everything got canceled. So that it all made it a little bit of a moot point. But those are great things to try and think about as things open up, like you say, Sherry. All right, should we go on to the next slide? I see Doug nodding his head.
All right, and I'm now also seeing that people have been using the questions feature to ask questions. And here's a good question, so I'll share this one. Can someone let us know what criteria goes into deciding which sites are closed or which aspects of the sites are being closed? On the Madison River, it seems rather subjective. Some entire sites are closed. Some have just campground portions, but launch is open. It would be good to know why there is a subjective nature to the determination, and also when will these be reevaluated to be open? And actually, I think this is a perfect slide to talk about this topic on.
Doug, you want to tell us the story about this slide? It's a great photo.
Sure. So this is just one of those things that was going on in Florida, always on the vanguard of good ideas. What was happening is that one county said that their beaches were closed and another county did not. And they patrolled it. So the empty beach is the one that has a restriction and the other one is not. And of course, what it did is increase the density in one place and make it 0 in the other place. The wisdom of it, well, some of the ideas behind this are there's overlapping jurisdictions. Nobody really knows who's in charge, right? It could be state, could be local, a county, or a city even, or possibly even the federal government. And then we've got agencies making decisions for their individual lands that may be different than what you have as an overlay from your state or your county. And it leads to a lot of confusion, I think. And but what it ultimately results in is that human beings make decisions based on what they think is happening. And then they go to places and they try to do stuff. And we know how that works, right? We're out on rivers a lot, and we see people doing what they do and reacting to rules in interesting ways, and they look for loopholes and things like that. So in this case, you got this interesting county line where there's an even higher density right at the county line, because they got basically shoved over. And they don't want to break the rules, but they're also probably not paying attention to the spirit of the rules either. And so we have a lot of communication we're going to have to make happen this summer if we're going to let people out there. And they probably can't be at the densities they're used to. We're going to have to work hard at all those kinds of places like put-ins, takeouts, restrooms, and whatnot to either make them cleaner, make people use their own, or and somehow keep the densities low so that they can keep some spacing between them. And all of that's going to be a challenge because people are like ants. They go everywhere and they do stuff. So.
Well, and in answer to that, or I don't know about to answer, but to kind of speak to the question that was asked about, how do we get to be consistent? Who's making those decisions? Those are great questions. And, there's not just one answer. It obviously varies from place to place and varies from site to site. I think one of the things we're seeing is kind of everybody has become an expert. So sometimes those calls are getting made by, a person that we think of as being a little bit at the low end of the totem pole or the low end of the food chain. It could easily be some maintenance person who says, I don't think I can keep this closed, and I'm going to put a padlock on it. The place I was one of those places I was describing to you, has just a giant, big old forestry, obviously taken from closing up forest gates, padlock on the bathroom. And I think sometimes those things get made pretty far down. On the other hand, we've also got people, all the way up at the state level, or I don't know about the national level, or supervisors' offices, things like that, who are making the call. You will do X, and then it just kind of moves its way down the food chain. So I think it's a great question. Maybe something about introducing a little more consistency and maybe some criteria into that decision making is part of what might come out of an effort like this among river managers. We'll talk at the end about kind of where do we go from here, and that's let's revisit that topic of it. Are there ways to make this better? How about the next slide?
We've got one more. Sorry, I'm kind of quick catching up on a bunch of questions that I've just seen.
No, that's your job.
Somebody wants to know, what is the authority of managers to close a navigable stream? Are they confident in that authority? So it's a great question. Do these managers even have the legal authority to make these closures?
Oh, who wants to answer that one? Sounds like a good Dr. Whitaker question.
Well, navigability is a fraught topic. In some states and federal government don't always agree on which things are navigable. In other states, they do. If you have, we're seeing this in national politics as well. If you have a state and a federal government that don't agree, you've got some challenges on your hands. And this could be another one of those places where that conflict comes into play. It'd be nice if our governments at every level were sort of in sync, but doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon. So I'm not sure I have a good answer for that. But you can just imagine if we get later into the summer and there becomes a dividing line or a continuum of people who feel it's safe versus people who don't, you can imagine people jumping from below the ordinary high water mark to above it in deciding whether they're legal or not and where they're supposed to be. Anyway, it could get that ugly and it's silly, but it's that jurisdiction problem. Who's in charge? It's not clear. I think some places are going to have strong superintendents or river managers or others that make a decision, have a good criteria and good rationale for it. People buy into it and everything goes smoothly. In other places, we'll have little rebellions of people who don't agree with some decision and try to work around it. And then we're going to have sort of a little bit of chaos as some people are out on rivers and other people are upset about it. I've heard about a case in Michigan where I think the rule is that if you're in a non-motorized craft, you're allowed to be out on water, like in a kayak or something. But if you're in a powerboat, you're not. And gee, I guess that got some powerboaters upset, like you'd expect. So anyway. tough decisions, I think.
And back to the jurisdiction thing here in Oregon, the way the state's mandate is worded, you're not supposed to travel except for necessary things, and exercise is listed in the categories of necessary things. So I guess that means if you were in your vehicle traveling to go paddle your kayak for exercise, that'd be okay, but maybe not if you were just going to have fun. Those are interesting things to separate. I think, maybe back to the kind of the content as opposed to the jurisdictional disputes. There'll be some jurisdictional disputes, but I think in terms of controlling the controllables, the things that we as river management folks can work on most effectively, having thought through what we're doing and having a good rationale and working within the, kind of the authorities that we feel like we have some familiarity with and control over may be the best thing that we can do. And if somebody trumps us with something like trumps, no pun intended. Sorry, Sherry. If somebody trumps us with something like a navigability proclamation, so be it, right? We will have done the best we could. All right. This next slide kind of hints at, and Dan, again, feel free to interject anything that you're getting there. There's the time lag problem, so it's fine to just interrupt on that. The question here is, when things open up again, what are the issues that we need to be thinking about? And so this is starting to look forward a little bit more than just reporting our current situation, but at least what we're seeing around here, there are a lot of people who haven't, the weather is finally getting better, and people are excited about getting out. They've been cooped up, and there may be a lot of kind of pent up demand and excitement about getting out. So as things open, we tried to brainstorm a list of things that, to kind of a checklist, things to kind of think through. And the first item on that list, do you have that list in front of you, Doug, or am I the only one with that list? The first item on the list was who decides.
I don't have that list.
Okay.
Sorry.
I'm pretty sure you dictated that list to me just yesterday, so you must have it somewhere. But
yeah, well, somewhere. But
anyway, so what are those first things? And I guess this actually is a follow-on to that jurisdictional question that got asked a minute ago. Who decides whether it's time to reopen? Some of that is going to get handed to us from above or from sideways or something like that. But whenever there is a decision that things can loosen up a little bit, and everybody's excited about that, one question will be, okay, who's got the authority or who's got the good information? So again, back to control the controllables. What are the things that as a river manager, you really are the person who may know the most? Kind of start thinking about, well, all right, what are the factors that would suggest that this is safe? What are the things that need to be handled in order to maintain, if we take off one set of guidelines, but we've got another still in place, have we thought through all these different issues? Like, for example, so that's the number 2 item on this list. What about the places where people get in and get out? So at put-ins and takeouts, what are we going to have to do differently?
All right, I've got a few things that people have mentioned they're doing for mitigation throughout the webinar that I think now is a good time to share. On one river, somebody's outfitters are requesting decontamination stations at the takeouts for their gear. Somebody mentioned during the norovirus that in New Zealand, they put a ton of signage at trailheads and all over the park, warning people about mitigation, and we might do something similar now. A couple different people have said they're limiting group size and they're trying really hard to stay open for family recreation because they think it is a safe activity to do while social distancing. But also they're having a hard time getting agency support for limiting permits to locals, which is something that could potentially mitigate a lot of the risk involved. Others looking at changing their toilet systems to something more contained, but they're worried about where to put the waste. So there we go. That's a few things that people are doing. And also I got a comment that people would like to heard that there were going to be 24 panelists. And so they're wanting to hear from more of the panelists. So if any of the other panelists feel like speaking up, please feel free to do so.
Coulter, you wrote a long piece about the Flathead and what's going on there. And feel like you want to tell us that?
Still muted.
There we
Hi
go.
there, are you able to?
Sorry about that, Coulter.
Yep, you're good, Coulter.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I actually didn't mean for it to be long. I think I did a duplicate paste, but my name's Coulter Pence and I'm associated with the Three Forks of the Flathead in Northwest Montana with the Flathead National Forest. And yeah, what we're seeing here is some unusual use patterns. We're seeing people attempting to do multi-night, overnight trips. And we would never expect that this time of year, given that it's still in the 30s and low 40s at night. It wouldn't be unusual to see people starting to get out and do day trips a little bit here and there, and that use is certainly up. But the overnight this time of year is a little stunning. And yeah, since we're not providing visitor services at our access site, we're not addressing some demands there and possible future resource concerns, but just sharing one use pattern here that's unusual for us.
All right, and I've got a comment from one of the attendees. So I'm going to turn his microphone on and see what he has to say. Go ahead, Matt.
Hey everybody, this is Matt Moses. I own USA Raft Adventure Resort on the Tennessee, North Carolina state line. We are mostly, as far as water activities, our Class 4 Nolichucky Gorge trip is the most common. We raft that under a U.S. Forest Service Pisgah Ranger District permit. So we've got a long season here in the Southeast. We open in March usually. So right now I would have 70 kids running around the property. We have cabins and such. But the Forest Service is not letting commercial permit holders raft due to social distancing. And, they keep saying, what if they come out of the boat? Matt, you got to get them back in. So it's unlikely that we'll be able to raft. We're starting to think this whole season commercially, but for private boaters, they have literally closed all river access points that they own and manage. Doesn't necessarily mean they're gated. Doesn't necessarily, people aren't still using them. We don't see nearly as many kayakers, but there's still plenty of that going on. But anyway, wanted to weigh in on that. In the Southeast, it's a lot of national forest management. And with us being on the state line, we also have permits with Cherokee National Forest. And the two are managed very differently and, for better and worse. But so we expect to be able to operate on our Class 3 lower Nolichucky and have caving operations in Tennessee, but we might be able to open up fully in Tennessee and not in our North Carolina operations, which presents, particular problems. But anyway, thought I would share that and let everyone know that there's commercial people on here as well. Appreciate y'all doing this.
Great, thanks.
Great. Yeah, thanks for sharing, Matt.
Hey, Dan, we're actually, Joby, you're up next. Dan, we're a couple of slides behind, actually. We had a who decides and that launches slide. There you go. All right, Joby.
Joby Chikuchin, I'm with Big Cypress in South Florida, in Okeechobee, Florida. We have similar situations with concessionaires and boat operators, the guides. that have been suspended because of ongoing developments with just social distancing, and because airboats would tend to have 10 people sitting next to each other, and all those operations have been suspended. The guides naturally, the river guides naturally just lost clients because of travel restrictions. So part of that is just the way it develops, travel restrictions. Most of the tourists would come in the wintertime and taper off in the summertime because it gets too hot down here. So I don't know how people are going to stay afloat, those small businesses, and if they're going to come back at all. I don't know. Tough one.
It is a tough one. By the way, one of the things that fits with the comment that we got from our outfitter, one of the folks on the RMS call was pointing out that in his supervising of the river use on the Snake River and Jackson Hole, this is Dave Cernicek, he said, well, I've invited outfitters to come to me with proposals where they think they can maintain the criteria that we feel like we need to operate under, and that I will approve anything that solves the problems, essentially. So that's I guess that encourages all of us to be creative about coming with solutions rather than just sitting back and understanding that there are problems. I hear people on this call saying that.
So, and one of the things that launches, for instance, is that's where parties intermix, right? Because they're all at a bottleneck. And one of the things you can do to reduce densities is you could get rid of half of the parking spaces by putting picnic tables in them or whatever, and then that would sort of artificially make people's vehicles be a little farther away. Some structural things like that might be, a way to sort of trick ourselves into being more mindful of what's going on and how close you are to other people. Scheduling was something that we talked about earlier. That's a big deal. And just everybody waiting their turn, just recognizing that, when one party's at the launch, maybe the other parties don't get to be there. They have to kind of give it up. And then once they're out of there, then the next party can come in. Those are the kinds of things you could do, but it obviously takes a bunch of effort to do that, as well as possibly on-site effort. And then that puts your staff at risk. So, there's kind of trade-offs to all of these things. Anyway, those are things we've been thinking about.
Anything in your chat box, Dan, or let's go to the next slide.
Okay, yeah. So Janie Pardo from the Umpqua River down in Southern Oregon, she says all their rec sites are closed because the whole forest is closed, but their rec sites are not able to be physically closed, as in there's not a gate. So they're still seeing people use the parks, but also they don't have the staffing right now to actually patrol and enforce all those sites, and even if they did, they're concerned about staff safety. So right along all those same lines that we've been talking about.
Okay. We talked a little bit about distancing between groups. This slide reminds us about distancing within groups. If the groups are those pods like we talked about, if people come as a group that's already in contact with each other, we think of those as family groups or household groups, then putting them in a boat together is not a problem. On the other hand, if you have to put a guide in the boat, that's a different ball game. So I guess similarly, depends on how big the boat is. Can you get the people who need to be apart from each other far enough apart? So that's the kind of the within group question.
Next slide.
And Sherry, I saw you gesturing. Were you actually trying to get a word in edgewise?
No, I was trying to figure out the question feature, so go ahead, Bo.
About the time this thing ends, we'll all have figured out a few things that it would have been nice to know back at the beginning, kind of like a river trip. All right, so this slide, again, just another prompt about some different parts of this thing. You get past the put in, you get there in pods in cars. You figure out the boat thing. How do you keep the boats apart? So, do we have lineups at rapids where we need to figure out ways to create more distance? Does this mean we change capacity? By the way, as people who have worked on capacities for a lot of years, one of the things that we've been sort of smiling about is all of a sudden everybody's a lot more interested in capacities than we used to be, and that's because we've got some enforced standards for how far apart people can be, or how often, or how how much time there needs to be between when one person or one group is in a place versus another, or uses a piece of equipment like somebody was talking about a minute ago. So,
well, and also the meme of the season is flattening the curve, right? And we didn't have a phrase like that, but that's basically what we spent 30 years trying to convince river managers to do, which is, chop off those peaks and get them placed someplace else. Makes everybody's trip better. And now we have a meme, but it's in this negative context, so we don't know if we'll ever get to use it again. So.
Well, or whether we'll want to use it. This is going to be the bad old days, not the good old days.
Right.
But again, and this thing not only points out that getting people separated on the river is an issue, but also in camps. And we have different kinds of camps in different places. Sometimes the camps are on a lot of our overnight rivers. They're natural areas, and so there really are opportunities to keep people distant from each other if the groups aren't too big. On the other hand, sometimes camps are small and tight, and if we go with the same size groups as we've been using in the past, maybe they're too close. So that's the thought process that we need to all work our way through, so that we've got answers and solutions. Anything?
I've got a comment here from Jennifer Reed, who's a National Fish and Wildlife Manager up in Alaska. She wanted to share that Alaska is seeing a surge in local use earlier than expected, while governor's mandates have afforded more leisure time for families. There is also historical trauma in most remote Alaska Native communities that are gateways to public land units. And I agree with that. We've seen the same thing here in Oregon. There's a lot of places that are closed, but the places that are open are really busy because people have a lot of time on their hands.
Okay, next slide, Dan. We've talked a little bit about commercial use, but obviously that's and I think maybe we've covered the things here, but we've kind of got all those elements magnified by commercial use, because we've got busloads of people instead of carloads of people. We've got people in boats with guides as opposed to just people in boats of their own. We've got multiple boats, so those things all magnify. On the other hand, one of the things that outfitters are really good at compared to private boaters is they're good at figuring out solutions and instructing people and setting up their equipment to be more efficient and effective. And so I think for the outfitters on the call, that's great that you guys are thinking about solutions. And if you can get people to work with you in terms of, okay, what's the problem? Have we got a solution that we can all live with? That seems like the problem-solving process that we're all trying to get towards. And recognizing that outfitters both have some challenges that non-outfitters don't have, but also that they've got some solutions at their disposal that would help them with that.
And this goes to some of the issues that people are talking about with public transport around the world. Can we make our subways and buses and public transport more safe for folks? And there's thoughts about more dividers and plexiglass and frequent cleaning and sanitation stations everywhere, everybody wearing masks. All that kind of stuff is going to play into that. And none of us are quite sure how this disease exactly works and which things are really higher risk versus lower risk on that. But that may get discovered in the next 3 months, and at least by the end of the season, we might start to understand a little bit about whether it really is safe to throw people on a bus for a couple of hours or an hour or a half hour, if they're all wearing face masks or not. We might know that answer sometime, maybe not in time for the first part of the season, but maybe by the end. So there's things like that that I think are possible. There are places in the world right now that are a lot more dense than a lot of our cities, and not all of them are exploding with outbreaks. So maybe there's some hope there somewhere.
All right.
I've got a comment.
Okay.
I've got a comment from David Brown. Says TWRA in Tennessee has all access point closed and has not planned to close them. The challenge for outfitters is transportation. There may be some changes to these distancing requirements later in the summer. Just along those same lines. And I've gotten a couple of comments about people saying, how are we deciding why some access points are closed while other ones are remaining open? And I would say I think a lot of those decisions are being made on an emotional level right now because we don't really have the science yet to back up which things are actually safe and which things are not. And so I think is depending a lot on the individual managers and the context of where you're at. Okay, I'm gonna go to the next slide.
But while you're doing that, the other thing that's interesting here is it's really tough in conversations like this. If anybody can come up with any objection that hints at a risk, it's hard to overcome those things. So these are conversations that are hard to have. All right, Doug, you want to tell this story about this slide? We need to keep moving, by the way. We're getting close to our end and we got a couple more slides.
Yeah, that's fine. So the state of Alaska has decided that fishing is an essential activity, fishing and hunting. And they've also decided that guided fishing is an essential business, which means that even if we have hunker down rules like we do in our state at the moment, fishing will continue. And so that's going to be sort of interesting because depending on the kind of fishing you do, you may or may not have social distancing. This is how they fish for red salmon in a few places in Alaska. It's really shoulder to shoulder, and they're not of the same group and the same household, obviously. So that's probably not a safe activity. But they've basically promised people in our state that we will have fishing this summer, and it includes personal use fishing, which is that dip net scene down in the lower right-hand corner that they do at the mouths of a couple of rivers. And again, people are pretty close to each other, and then they're cleaning fish close to each other. They're camping very close to each other. It's going to be some real challenges to managing those activities, which the governor here anyway has decided that absolutely have to go on. So we'll have some interesting things there. The decision to go with guided fishing is particularly interesting because that puts a lot of people in boats together in close proximity. The guides in particular, I think, are taking some risks there because they're going to have different people each day. But again, that's been promised so far to those folks, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
All right, next slide, Dan. All right, the reminder here is that it's not just the kind of organized stuff that we've been talking about of people showing up at a put-in and they kind of get their trip organized and they travel down the river and they camp, and all that stuff is relatively organized compared to a lot of the other recreation use that occurs on rivers. And so even if you work with those things that seem more manageable or more equally organized or regulated, there needs to be some thought given to other things like what you see here. People rivers are great places to hang out, and there's a lot of hanging out that occurs on rivers, and a lot of that is also associated with kind of disorganized or decentralized access places. So we need to be able to think that stuff through as well.
We expect this summer, if it's following the way things are working here, even in Alaska, where we still have a bunch of snow on the ground, the trailheads are packed. People are home. The only time they get to go out, since they can't go to restaurants and bars and work, is they're going to recreation sites. And when they're out on the trails, it's not so bad. But at the trailhead, it's a bad scene. And on rivers, it'll be these pods, these cool beaches are going to be just like the Florida beach problem. The popular ones are going to still be popular. It's going to be a lot of people at them, and there's very rarely management going on there.
All right. How about the last slide, Dan? All right. So this is just wrapping up. We're just a minute or two past our wrap up time here. The question is, what's coming up? We've thought through some of that systematically. I guess the question here is, are there some things that you all would like to do collectively that might help you out? And maybe that's something for people to think about, and we can converse or exchange some emails through the RMS kind of umbrella about, you know, would it help to have a working group? Would it help to have some kind of, you know, more better organized information from all the different rivers around? You know, would it help to have a survey of river managers and a report out on that? Would it help to put together some other kinds of activities about criteria for opening up or criteria for managing different kinds of sites or things like that? So anyway, those are things that we've all kind of been brainstorming a little bit about, and it's something for the ongoing conversation. I don't think we're going to answer all of that right now, but that's kind of the news that we would try to wrap up on here.
I've got a comment from the chat window to kick that off. Bob Ratcliffe says, "Hey river folks, the federal land agency leadership and incident teams are now developing reopening strategies and protocols. It is likely it will be phased and rolling reopenings depending on CDC, state, regional, local restrictions. The key question RMS could help with are identifying and collecting recommended river COVID operations protocols and practices. Things like timed launches and takeouts, limits on group sizes, public communications on social distancing on river, enforced crowd managed access areas, etc. I look forward to seeing those recommendations so we can advise national decision makers and rec leadership."
All right, good. That's great. Hey, Bob Ratcliffe, it's great to have you here. And just in the spirit of the way a conversation would go, if we were in the same room and there was like a beer on the table, Bob, you guys, I heard Ratcliffe tell you that he's got the answers to all the questions that have been raised during this seminar. So there you go, Bob. It's on you, bud.
We apologize that there wasn't more interactiveness in this format, and you know, obviously we have more to learn about there. I didn't get to see most of those questions that Dan was obviously getting, and I can't find them in the chat or the questions, so we don't know about that, and we also don't know about the you know, how to get more of our panelists on board and on screens. So if anyone wants to send us emails about that, about better platforms and better ways to go about this, that would be nice. But we do promise to get you some of the materials from this session so that you'll at least have some, you know, the slides and the chat and the questions that got answered, so that you can at least have that for yourselves to think about these issues, and maybe it'll help spark some ideas.
Right.
And,
there's also a list of the participants that I think we can send out that has emails and things like that. So
right, and the spreadsheet has the rivers that people are managing, whether theirs was open, limited, or closed, and whatever other comments they wrote down in their registration form. So we'll make sure you get all that, and hopefully that will be helpful. We apologize that it was more one way than we expected or anticipated, but maybe for a first start at this topic, it's enough to get us thinking anyway.
So we have about a dozen comments from attendees that are responding to this last slide. So I could see this going one of two ways. I could just read these off, or I could, if we actually want to hear people, I could kick the microphone over to them and let them say it. What do you guys think?
Sure.
Yeah, go.
Go ahead and read them. Okay. All right. On the Rogue, one struggle as many is centered around installation of bear fences. Forest Service has suspended their jet boat operations to comply with Oregon Governor's order. The jet boat is a tool to install the bear fences. Installation involves Forest Service, BLM, and ODFW. One solution is to contract the installation. The problem question is, why are we putting in infrastructure for rafting but have none, or things are closed to hikers and other types of recreation? We are going to ask permit holders for voluntary suspension. Season begins May 15th. I definitely wouldn't want to camp at some of those sites on the road without the bear fence, that's for sure. Fishing is allowed in Virginia. This is Bryce Wilk. Fishing is allowed in Virginia and specifically on the James River in Richmond. We have limited the capacity at the parking lots of major fishing sites to help ensure social distancing. With that said, has anyone else attempted limiting the parking, and what are the results, not just for fishing, but any recreation use on the rivers? And panelists, feel free to jump in here anytime if you want to say something. David Brown, we need to have a good way to disinfect PFDs. U.S. Coast Guard says air dry for 3 days, which is not feasible. And that was, there was somebody else earlier who was saying the same thing, that their outfitters were requesting some kind of decontamination station. So I don't know if that would look like a big, a big tub that you just get all of your customers to just dump their life jacket in and swish it around. The set of topics is really nice. I'd like to see a rationale for opening, maybe different than criteria, but justification managers are using. So that's from Krita. I think she's basically just wondering what stuff can we point to that to show people that we can safely open some of these places. Jaden Mead, assigning launch times with permits is something we have talked about for the Desolation Canyon once our high use season starts in May. Sherry Hughes, please keep me posted if another permitted river initiates something like that. Somebody says, Cindy Stein says, thumbs up for recommended river protocol. Bryce Wilk again, volunteers are a major component in the success of keeping our river clean and the population mentally and physically healthy. We initially stopped all volunteers activities, but now we are using trusted groups and individuals to begin volunteering again with trash removal, invasive removal, and tree planting. What are other river managers doing with volunteer policies? All right. Jen Reed again, up in Alaska. Recommended best practices for Ratcliffe, but also 30,000-foot view flow chart from decision-making about closures, which is what Alaska is grappling with. Realizing we are behind you all by a couple months. We are eager to learn from the lower 48. Jeremy Lewis, would it be possible to have future webinars like this as news develops? I think that's definitely possible, and we can keep this group informed of that. If there's a major development, we can all get back together and talk about it. All right. Okay. Finally, from Lelia, RMS is starting a state river managers group. They will try to address many of these questions at that level. All right. And then that's all the questions that I have right now. But if anybody has something longer or something else that they want to say, or any resources that they want to share, please send them our way, and we will put them together and package them with the slideshow, so that people can look at all this stuff again and share it with their colleagues if they want to.
All right, great. That seems like a good note to wrap up on. I appreciate all of you managing to get to this. great to get together a little bit. And like Doug said and Dan said, we'll try and get better at this whole format. It's got some challenges to it. Thanks for your time. Everybody stay safe out there, and let's keep talking to make it so that these river openings can be as soon and as successful as possible. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.